and I will present the results on the GEA scenarios for universal modern energy access. There were several chapters within the global energy assessment that focused on access issues. Chapter 2, which deals with energy and social issues, presents the situation as to how energy impacts socioeconomic well-being. Chapter 19 was called Energy Access for Development and focused really on what are the current situations across the globe in terms of access to modern energy, what have been the historical trends. And chapter 17, which was the scenarios chapter, the pathways chapter, also included a whole section on pathways specifically for achieving modern energy and access globally. And finally, there was also a chapter which dealt with policies for energy access. In my presentation, I will focus largely on materials from chapter 19 and chapter 17.4. And as has already been mentioned, all the materials from the Global Energy Assessment are publicly available. So this is the website where you can download all the materials. And before I start, I'd just like to take a few seconds to remember Professor Abeku Hammond, who was the co-CLA for the chapter on energy access for development, who unfortunately and suddenly passed away a few weeks ago. I'll start with stating what is the current status of global modern energy access. The map shown here depicts the density of populations without access to electricity and without access to clean cooking fuels or stoves. And what's important to notice from the map is that the darker red and blue areas, areas, are areas which are areas of concern, and as you can see very clearly, this is South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Pacific Asia. Globally, of course, 40% of population has no access to clean cooking, 20% doesn't have access to electricity. And why did we focus on electricity? Well, because of course electricity is central to all aspects of well-being. We need it for private benefits like illumination, communications, entertainment, and so on. It's important for income generation, we know that, and also for community services like education and healthcare. In addition, we looked at access to modern cooking fuels and stoves, and the reason for doing so is because we know globally over 3 billion people still rely on solid fuels, and this has very many negative consequences. So in fact, there are consequences for social well-being. We know that actually over 4 million deaths are now estimated to be attributed to solid fuel use, and many hours, particularly human hours, are lost annually in the collection of firewood and other biomass sources. It impacts livelihoods because, of course, this time could have been used more productively in other enterprises, and limits work and business possibilities. And of course, there are also environmental impacts. People seem to think that biomass being a renewable source has no impacts on the environment, but in fact, we know that there are many greenhouse gas emissions associated with biomass incomplete combustion, and also aerosols like black carbon are increasingly important in terms of the climate impacts. So we tried to look at the question, how can we achieve universal access to modern energy by 2030? And we started looking at this question by looking at historical trends. If we look at electrification trends over the last century, we see, of course, the US was one of the first countries to electrify its entire population. And it achieved this basically within a period of 3 to 4 decades. Now, if we look at countries like Egypt, China, and Brazil, they too achieved this between 2 or 3 decades. But of course, we know there are many countries, India included, and also other countries like South Africa, where there are still significant proportions of the population that still don't have access to electricity. So for example, in India, we still have 2/3 of the population without access to electricity, and in South Africa, about 1/4 of the population still lacks access to electricity. So, I mean, basically our understanding from this historical analysis was that there were countries that achieved electrification rather rapidly, but then there were others that took very long in achieving this. And again, this graphic here sort of illustrates how electrification has occurred historically in different regions. The blue bars illustrate how population has changed and how electrified population has changed in different regions between 1970 and 1990. And the pink or purple bars illustrate how the same information between the decades of 1990 and 2010. And again, what's important to see is that the pace of electrification has varied tremendously across time and across regions. There are countries like China, Thailand, Vietnam that have really achieved this very, very rapidly. And there are others that are still lagging far behind. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are many countries where population growth, particularly in rural areas, still outpaces the number of new connections that are provided. When we look at the trends in access to modern energy for cooking, the situation is actually more dismal, because over the last decade, there has been almost no change in terms of the percentage dependence on solid fuels. And in fact, if we look at just biomass, so not including coal dependence, we see that the number of people dependent on biomass alone declined only very marginally over the last decade. And this was basically because of some reduction in the dependence on biomass in China. However, we know that in addition to these numbers, there are 30% of people in China that still depend on coal for cooking and heating, and over 10% of people depending on charcoal. And basically, in rural areas, dependence on solid fuels has remained almost unchanged over the last decade in many developing countries. So basically, we carried out scenarios, and we see that without new and dedicated policies, the access goals by 2030 will not be achieved. And this graphic shows you how the populations dependent on solid fuels will change between 2005 and 2030 with no new policies. We see that in fact, while the percentage declines, the number of people in fact increases. And this is the situation with regards to rural electrification. So while the number of people again getting electrified increases, we will still not reach universal rural electrification by 2030 without new policies. So we looked at different policy packages that could perhaps get us to this goal. And what we again observed is that without new policies, we'll have more people without access to modern fuels for cooking and heating. If we only apply subsidies for modern fuels, we find that we do, of course, reduce dependence on solid fuels, but this alone will not get us to where we need to go. If we give microfinance on new stoves, this also achieves partially the goal, but we would not again achieve the goal of 2030 universal access. However, if we combine fuel subsidies on modern fuels with microfinance or grant options for new stoves, then the combination of policies is much more effective. In terms of looking at the implications of achieving such a goal, that is universal access to modern energy by 2030, we look at what it means for energy demand in 2030. And basically what this graphic shows you is that, of course, demand for electricity and modern fuels like LPG will rise, but total household final energy demand will be lower with access policies, basically because we are substituting very little LPG for lots of biomass. Biomass combustion is 4 to 5 times less efficient than LPG. So in fact, we'll have lower total final energy demand, even though of course electricity and LPG demand will rise. And therefore, we also notice that greenhouse gas emissions due to access policies will be almost negligible. The changes will be almost negligible. This again is because we account for the emissions associated with incomplete biomass combustion, so methane and nitrous oxide, which often is not accounted for in many other assessments of a similar kind. And in addition, if we assume that some percentage of biomass that is currently used is not renewably harvested, then of course the impacts are even more negligible. Finally, we also look at health benefits of access to modern cooking, and of course we know that we could save over 2 million lives in 2030 if universal access to modern cooking were achieved. So in answer to the question what it will take to achieve universal access by 2030, we find that we would require about 40 billion annually in terms of investments every year till 2030. This is less than 8% of current fossil fuel subsidies globally. We need detailed local assessments of existing demands, affordabilities, and options for expanding access. Because of course, this was a global analysis and we looked at policies at a very macro scale. Actual solutions will differ from region to region and require detailed assessments and analysis. We focused, we also found that focus and sustained government commitment and targeted and responsive policies are essential for achieving these goals. The countries which have achieved universal access to modern energy or close to this goal have illustrated that there have been targeted price support, at least for those portions of the population that can't afford modern fuels and stoves. And basically one needs to combine policies including both support on modern fuels and grants or easier access to microcredit for the poor population groups. We need flexible and adequate institutional arrangements with local involvement and enhanced capacity building. And finally, there's a need for new business models and mechanisms to incentivize private sector involvement in, and to ensure cost recovery. So I'll end with that, but I'll show you the last couple of slides. This is the Global Energy Assessment Database, again publicly available. A lot of our information is included on this database. So anyone interested in looking at the numbers more closely, please do go visit the website. We've also, in conjunction with the work we've done for the Global Energy Assessment, developed two policy tools at IIASA. One is the Energy Access tool, which basically presents a lot of the analysis and results associated with what I've just presented here. And this is again publicly available. You can go to the website and have a look at it. The other is the Energy MCA tool, which really looks at the synergies and trade-offs across different multiple objectives for the energy sector. Again, publicly available, so please, you're welcome to visit the website. Thank you very much.